This is Aliceville, a low-security women's prison in rural Alabama where more than 1,400 inmates are serving time.
How devastating would it be if the same barriers built to protect justice ended up causing unfathomable pain? Hiding from the world's most infamous jails is an uphill struggle. Overcrowding, extreme violence, and deplorable circumstances are hallmarks of prison life, and they destroy the will of the convicts. Each day is a struggle for survival and any semblance of humanity in these 10 jails, which are the worst. Consequently, turn on your light source, because we are going to explore the dank halls of these 10 worst jails for women on Earth. Number 10. Tadmore Prison, Syria. A sense of dread and despair is evoked by the very word of Tadmore Prison, which is located in the parched, wide Syrian desert near Palmyra. It is notorious for its brutal treatment of inmates, particularly women, and has been called hell on earth on several occasions. Envision a place where sorrow looms large, hope is a distant memory, and the echo of suffering echoes along foreboding, gloomy hallways. The now famous Tadmore Prison was formerly a French military installation, but became famous in the 1980s for housing political dissidents. It became a symbol of despotism and brutality under Hafez al-Assad's reign. You have discovered the ideal location if you are seeking an establishment that focuses on depressing rather than uplifting its patrons. We are God, the gods declare repeatedly. We have the power to decide the fate of you. This terrifying statement summed up the standard practice in all Syrian prisons, particularly those housing political prisoners, not only Tadmore Prison in Palmyra. According to Amnesty International, torture and humiliation were commonplace and marked by everyday hardship. Picture yourself in a place where being there is punished in some way if you think your worst workday was bad. After an unsuccessful attempt to assassinate President Assad failed, Tadmore saw one of its most infamous occurrences on June 27, 1980, a massacre in which 600 to 1,000 captives were mercilessly murdered. Everyday life in Tadmore was marked by a larger trend of state-authorized violence, of which this brutal act was a part. Everything in Tadmore is very gloomy and dreary. Put yourself in a situation where you are unable to do any of your basic human rights, such as visiting loved ones, reading, or communicating with the outside world. Inmates are subjected to continual psychological and physical torture. Degrading actions, such as being forced to consume dead animals, electric shocks that leave lifelong scars, and severe beatings with rods and wires are common torture methods. According to one ex-con who shared her story, a knock on the cell door often meant one thing: another prisoner has died. Instead of providing a welcome escape into nature, the courtyard became a platform for capricious executions. Prisoners would be brutally beaten or worse when guards would single them out for breaching. To stay alive in this setting is to rebel against hopelessness. Inmates' living circumstances are more like something out of a nightmare than a reality show when female inmates are either in solitary confinement or partnered with another female inmate. They are subjected to brutal beatings and sexual assaults, and the shame of being made to admit to wrongdoings adds insult to injury. Tales from Tadmore are starting to surface, despite the regime's repressive silence. Inmates' ordeals are described in depth in testimonies. In order to get over the state's censorship, memoirs written by ex-convicts have appeared online, revealing their stories. In addition to providing much-needed emotional release, these testimonies strongly condemn a government that uses terror as a weapon. Number 9. Hongjang Prison, China. The cemetery of Falun Gong is the moniker given to the secluded women's prison in China's northeast, where the walls house more than just dead. They also contain the unspoken histories of those who have fought and triumphed against overwhelming odds. In the midst of oppressive circumstances and a tight government, optimism wavers like a candle in the breeze. The jail has a terrible reputation for its repressive environment and the harsh punishments that convicts face, which put an emphasis on control rather than rehabilitation. Its notoriously harsh treatment of female prisoners, especially Falun Gong practitioners, is another reason for its notoriety. The prisoners endure physical torture, sleep deprivation, and forced work. For instance, Liu Ping detailed the excruciating sores that resulted from being confined to a little stool for long periods of time. Other convicts continually watched her and wouldn't let her use the bathroom. Another prominent case in point is that of Wang Chunyan, who, in addition to being jailed for her views, suffered similar abuses, such as being secluded from others and forced to watch propaganda movies. As a means of preventing them from learning from one another's experiences, these practitioners are kept apart. Because they would not abandon their faith, they are often subjected to physical and verbal abuse. Number 8. Bang Kuang Central Prison, Thailand. Ensnaring yourself in heavy iron chains was the first thing you did on your first day in prison, right? Anyone venturing inside Bang Kuang Prison, sometimes called the Bangkok Hilton, will face that reality. Despite the moniker, this is not a five-star establishment. A lot of foreign nationals end up in this brutal jail, which also holds those on death row and those serving lengthy sentences. Instead of basic amenities, inmates are met upon arrival with shackles that they must wear for the first 3 months of their incarceration. You read it correctly. Death row convicts are required to have their leg irons permanently welded on. Rest assured, these shackles have a purpose. They serve as a constant reminder that your former independence is a distant past, and that the challenges you face in your new existence at Bang Kuang will push you to your limits. Bang Kuang, built between 1927 and 1931, was originally intended by King Rama V to house the most notorious criminals. Its original purpose was to house inmates awaiting death or lengthy sentences, but it has evolved into a facility that might cause even the most remorseful of criminals to reevaluate their lives. Nearly 6,000 people are now incarcerated here, with many of them being foreign nationals entangled in the web of Thailand's stringent drug regulations. Many of these inmates either die or lose their sanity due to the terrible circumstances they are kept in. Worst-case scenario, you get food that looks more like it came from a trash than a restaurant. Inmates who aren't as well off are forced to eat rice and veggies every day, if they're fortunate, because of the notorious chit system. Think of it as a high-stakes poker game where you and your other prisoners attempt to bargain for more food. Have you thought about it all? Just hold just a second. Not only is the living conditions and food at Bang Kuang terrible, but the prison is also infamous for its cruel treatment of prisoners. The incessant stream of allegations detailing beatings and psychological torture makes one question whether the architect of this jail had a problem with horror film overload. Despite the fact that human rights groups have voiced concerns about the facility's history of torture and abuse. Some inmates have spoken of how guards physically assaulted them for seemingly minor offenses, such as not folding their linens properly or staring at a guard in the wrong manner. The drill instructor has completely lost his bearings, creating an atmosphere reminiscent of a warped version of boot camp. Some women in Bang Kuang have spoken about how they feel helpless and alone, with nowhere to turn when they have complaints about the way they were treated. As they face the challenges of prison life, convicts must rely on each other for survival, yet this tight-knit community may also spark tensions. Bangkok Hilton, a miniseries that aired in 1989, dramatizes the trials of a woman incarcerated for drug trafficking and brings attention to the terrible truths endured by female inmates in Bangkok's prisons, including the overcrowding and lack of critical supplies. Nevertheless, there have been initiatives to improve Bang Kuang's circumstances in the last several years. The removal of shackles from the majority of prisoners was a little triumph hailed in 2013, the equivalent of an Oscar in this bleak environment, by authorities. But many prominent convicts are still bound, so campaigners aren't sure whether things will ever change. Even though it has a terrible image, Bang Kuang is really rather popular in Thai culture. Countless films and articles have highlighted this bleak reality. Maybe it's just our morbid curiosity, but sites that symbolize human pain always manage to captivate people. Number 7. Ananura Prison, Madagascar. The island's stunning natural scenery is a sobering reminder that life behind bars is anything but glamorous at this jail in Madagascar's capital, Antananarivo. Prison life is a mental and physical ordeal for the women held in Antanamora because of the facility's lack of resources. It is known to be among the world's filthiest and most overcrowded jails for female inmates. A lot of the prisoners here sleep so closely together that they end up putting their feet on top of each other's heads. Despite having the room to accommodate 800 convicts, reports indicate that around 4,000 criminals are now housed there. The problem is worsened by the large number of inmates kept without trial for long periods of time. These inmates constitute around 60% of the jail population. Consider the example of Demoa, a 33-year-old woman who was placed in pretrial prison at Ananura Prison on March 10th on allegations of corrupting minors. She and her 19-year-old partner, Fee, were detained on charges of engaging in a same-sex relationship. It all started when Fee's mom tipped off the authorities. Anyone found guilty of an indecent or unnatural conduct with a person of the same gender under the age of 21 faces harsh penalties according to Madagascar's criminal law. Demoa was incarcerated for an additional 10 months despite being scheduled for an immediate and unconditional release. Inadequate nutrition and sanitation define this practice and many others like it. According to reports, inmates often go hungry since they only get one meal a day, which is often boiled cassava. Additionally, studies have shown that due to insufficient food quantity and quality, around 38.4% of female convicts suffer from malnutrition, a condition known as chronic undernourishment. Inmates with limited access to medical treatment have seen an increase in illness rates due to the inadequate hygienic conditions. The combination of unclean conditions and congestion makes for an ideal environment for the spread of infectious illnesses, which is a major concern at times of health crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been calls for reforms to Madagascar's prison system in response to these issues. The bad circumstances of Ananura Prison were brought to the attention of President Andry Rajoelina in 2019. Following this, his government has proposed measures to improve jail living conditions and reduce prison overcrowding. The goal is to raise the jail budget so that inmates have access to better meals and better sanitation facilities. Amnesty International and other international organizations have also called for better jail conditions and lower rates of pretrial detention. Overcrowding and human rights violations are major consequences of pretrial detention, which is why it should be very uncommon. Behind the scenes, unnoticed by the public eye, the quiet struggle of female inmates takes place. They stand in dimly lit corridors, expressionless as they wait, their features betraying their exhaustion and anger. No matter how careful one is, the effects of denying basic human rights will show on every face. Despite their tattered clothing, these women are more than simply numbers. They are distinct people with stories to tell and a constant fight against forces that dehumanize them. They serve as a reminder that every individual, whatever of the gravity of their offense, is deserving of respect and decency. Even when incarcerated, they must fight for their human rights. Number 6. Julia Tutwiler Prison, Alabama, USA. Inside the imposing walls of Julia Tutwiler Prison lies a truth that very few are willing to contemplate. There is incomprehensible anguish here. It is more than a jail. Established in 1942, Julia Tutwiler Prison was situated near Wetumpka, Alabama, and remained so for many years. It was christened after the jail reformer Julia Tutwiler, who fought for improved prison conditions. Unfortunately, one of the worst jails in the U.S. for female inmates is the one that carries her name. It has become notorious for cruelty and neglect. Julia Tutwiler has served populations near to 1,000 inmates on many occasions, despite its initial design intent to house about 550 inmates. Overcrowding has led to dire circumstances where fundamental human rights are routinely violated. Due to extensive sexual assault and inadequate medical treatment, Tutwiler was named by Mother Jones as one of the top 10 worst prisons in America in 2013. They seem to have completely disregarded the instruction to treat prisoners with dignity and respect. Worse still, the Equal Justice Initiative uncovered frightening evidence of sexual assault taking place on its grounds. Interrogations with over 50 detainees revealed a troubling pattern of violence between officers and inmates, including instances when female inmates became pregnant after being raped by guards. This tendency resembled a warped game of who can breach the rules first. After receiving a complaint from the EJI, the U.S. Department of Justice concluded that Alabama had violated the Eighth Amendment by failing to provide adequate protections for convicts against sexual assault. It's reasonable to assume that no business would want this type of publicity. Now picture yourself waking up every day in an uncertain place. When women here report abuse, they face retaliation from guards or social exclusion if they do so. The arbitrary seizure of a prisoner's locker box, which included priceless photographs and letters from her children, left her feeling as if her own identity had been snatched away. The prison's outdated and neglected infrastructure means that convicts sometimes have to settle for subpar medical treatment. A lady who was hospitalized outside of jail after a near-death experience was detailed in this instance. Her illness had been poorly managed. The storyline surprise that no one anticipated was really unexpected. Despair grows like weeds in a neglected garden due to the absence of mental health services, which exacerbates the already chaotic situation. Legitimate changes have moved at a snail's pace, despite many reports drawing attention to these abuses. As part of a larger prison reform effort, Alabama Governor Robert Bentley announced in January 2016 intentions to shut Tutwiler. However, this was like making a promise to clean your room but never really doing anything. But the institution is still operating, and the legacy of pain it left behind is unbroken as of 2020. Not only do the numbers show the human cost of imprisonment in such an atmosphere, but the anecdotes coming out of Tutwiler also show it. Many of the women who join this jail have experienced trauma in the past, such as abuse, and the harsh realities of prison life only serve to further depress their spirits. An emotional account was given by a former prisoner who had her soul crushed while incarcerated. Despite coming in with optimism, she departed feeling empty. Since there are no baby care facilities in Tutwiler, pregnant mothers have it especially bad. Mothers should only say farewell just after giving birth. The tales spoken at Julia Tutwiler Prison continue to be a call to action for justice and a warning to those who might err in the past. Number 5. Qubec Prison, Iran. If breathing seemed like an obstacle, what would you have done? Here, detainees at Qubec Prison face conditions that challenge and strain their endurance to its limits. Qubec, amid the arid desert southeast of Tehran, was nothing near being inhabited when it was first founded. The truth is that it was formerly a cattle processing plant. As one would expect from Iran's only all-female jail, the inmates there are not treated humanely. In circumstances that make one wonder how much one can take, the jail houses more than 1,000 women. Envision yourself living in such close quarters with another person that physical barriers not only merge but disappear altogether. Moreover, 1,700 convicts are being housed there, despite its initial capacity of 700. That's over double the prison's predicted capacity. The lack of access to burn medicine for convicts working in the boiler room and the kitchen is another major worry about their health. According to them, while psychotherapists at the prison clinic prescribe both sedatives and tranquilizers with abandon, IV drips are also hard to come by, and lab test results invariably come back late, even for those with cancer. The condition in the medical facility is awful, one of the prisoners recounted. They inject one prisoner into the same bed where they stitched another, who had cut himself. The latter's blood had stained the bed. The majority of inmates are undernourished since fresh fruit costs more than 3 times as much as it would at the market. Only once a month do they deliver fruits, and you can't eat 90% of them. The type of heat that clings to your flesh and sinks into your bones is constant, and the reliability of the water supply is more of a guess than a certainty. The ladies have to make do with whatever bottled water they can get, since there are days when it's not drinkable. Water for human consumption is sometimes either too salty, too murky, or completely non-existent. Mineral water costs 4,000 tomans, $1 a bottle for the well-off. There is no access to healthy food or clean water for moms and their children in the mother's ward. You could question whether it's worth it to wait in line for a shower, since they are a rare privilege. By the time you have your turn, the water is icy, not even a drizzle, and you'll be dry before you know it. Most convicts at Qubec Prison are always famished, as if that weren't bad enough. If a ward has more than 120 residents, they will provide 80 meals to those residents. Under the guise of the coronavirus, they would only consume meat when an inspector from the prison organization paid a visit. Even organizations delivering insufficient food were barred by SRA Kodad, the head warden. Living in Qubec is like being ensnared in a never-ending nightmare. Talk about extreme depravity. Overcrowding, scorching desert heat, and horrible conditions. It's a fantasy land. You would be mistaken if you believed things didn't grow worse. Just wait till you come across a jail that has a serial murderer and a juvenile detainee. Number 4. Indiana Women's Prison, USA. Is the prospect of a life behind bars for women anything that has ever crossed your mind? The Indiana Women's Prison has a long history, dating back to 1873. A band of reformers saw the light and realized that women were suffering in male jails. That was the beginning. Many people thought it was unjust and dangerous to be locked up with males. Advocates such as Rhoda Coffin and Sarah Smith were instrumental in getting Indiana to establish its first women-only institution. Sally Hubbard, who was found guilty of many murders, was the first female inmate to be admitted to the jail. It was quite an impactful beginning. But since 1900, no woman in Indiana has been executed, despite 4 women being condemned to death. Among the most notorious examples is that of Paula Cooper, a juvenile who was executed for her part in a crime when she was just 15 years old. As a result of the widespread outcry over her case, Pope John Paul II intervened, increasing the age of execution from 10 to 16 years old, and passing a statute prohibiting prison workers from having sexual contact with convicts. A therapist and 2 guards were accused of having sexual relations with Cooper, which led to this situation. Sarah Jo Pender, who escaped from Rockville Correctional Facility, is another infamous prisoner. In addition to shedding attention on problems within the prison system, her experience prompts us to consider how well women in jail get mental health assistance. The current site on Girls School Road is the prison's second relocation. The original site was near downtown Indianapolis. The objective was always rehabilitation, not only punishment for the convicts. Sewing and doing washing were among the many domestic tasks the women did, gaining skills that would aid them in making positive changes once they were released. Nevertheless, in the summer of 2020, inmates and their families voiced concerns about the harsh circumstances enforced at the women's jail in an effort to contain the new coronavirus. Half of the 650 convicts lived in unconditioned, out-of-the-way huts that lacked basic amenities like running water, bathrooms, and air conditioning. They also had the inmates locked in their cells for 18 to 20 hours every day. The jail responded by opening doors to enable more air to circulate and loosened restrictions, but it was still not apparent whether the issues had been fixed. Number 3. Prison Estonia. Prison, a location straight out of a horror film, is wedged between the Tallinn, Estonia shoreline. Despite its military history, the facility is today notorious as one of the world's worst jails for female detainees. The initial purpose of Prison, which dates back to the 19th century, was to stave against naval assaults on Tallinn. A spooky reputation, however, started to build up by the time it was converted into a jail in the 1920s. Its massive stone walls and barred windows were meant to frighten, and that is exactly what it accomplished. It was a terrifying cold for everyone who entered, not just the inmates. The way Pei dealt with female detainees brought national shame on the institution, since many of these women had been political prisoners during the Soviet regime. Picture yourself in a harsh environment where the chill goes deep into your being, where a thin straw mattress is your only source of warmth. An ex-inmate related the story of how, in the dead of winter, the cells would become covered in ice, making the ladies huddle closer together for warmth. The majority of the time, the ladies had little choice but to share frail blankets, which did nothing to ward off the cold. According to her, it was as if the chill was embedded in your very being, and you could feel it radiating forth. Because of the inadequate heating, several prisoners suffered from hypothermia and respiratory diseases. Another big problem at Pay Prison was overcrowding. Its maximum capacity was 4,200 convicts, even though it was originally built to accommodate 1,200. Inmates endured inhumane living circumstances as they were forced to share overcrowded quarters, with as many as 40 people crammed into spaces designed for far smaller numbers. If the prison's spooky past weren't bad enough, many think the souls of the prisoners still linger there. Paranormal activity, such as chilly breezes in dark chambers, voices resonating along corridors, and a pervasive feeling of sadness that seems to attach itself to every stone, are common complaints from visitors. The air in Pay is dense with whispered tales, regardless of your belief in ghosts. Number 2. Bohol Prison, Turkey. Bohol Prison is one of several Turkish correctional facilities that house female inmates. Bohol Prison is one of several Turkish correctional facilities that house female inmates, including those convicted of serious crimes and political dissidents. The jail is often criticized for its overcrowding and poor living conditions. Imagine yourself crammed into a small location with a bunch of other ladies, where you have very little room to move about and no privacy whatsoever. Being stuck in an interminable team task when no one wants to do their part is how it feels. Overcrowding occurs when the number of inmates residing in Bohol exceeds the initial capacity, which is 3 times the number of inmates originally planned to live there. Inmates often complain about the difficulty of finding any respite from the constant barrage of female inmates in their overcrowded quarters. Things is already a dire condition, and the lack of basic amenities like proper sanitary facilities is making things worse. Reports of mistreatment at Bohol Prison have become more concerning, as if that weren't bad enough. Inmates have spoken out about guards physically abusing them, including assaults for minor infractions or even for failing to follow instructions quickly enough. For fear of reprisal, many victims of domestic violence do not come forward to report the incident. Additionally, mental health services are underfunded. Upon arriving in Bohol, many women carry the weight of past traumas, only to find that the environment offers them very little support. People who are already vulnerable to mental health issues may have their symptoms intensify due to insufficient treatment. Number 1. Allah Prison, Egypt. There is a world of forgotten women behind the iron bars of Allah Prison, where their tales are buried under concrete whispers and misery. The world's biggest women's jail, situated in Qalyub on the outskirts of Cairo, Egypt, is a sobering illustration of the obstacles encountered by female inmates. This institution has been there since the early 1990s, but its history is complicated, and human rights reports have highlighted the terrible circumstances there. Cells are overcrowded, and there isn't enough air to circulate, according to the ladies. At the time of the interviews, the facilities were housing over 1,000 female inmates, despite an intended design intent of 500. The living conditions were appalling, with no access to natural light and air. Because of the overcrowding, poor ventilation, and lack of basic restroom facilities in these cells, the ventilation system is practically worthless. Inmates at Allah often endure harsh circumstances, including as sharing restrooms that aren't always available. As a result of not having access to adequate restroom facilities, the ladies in these cells must endure the intolerable odor of communal buckets for their personal waste. This sanitary condition mirrors the larger systemic negligence in Egypt's penal system and exacerbates health problems. However, the problem of menstruation hygiene compounds the already substantial difficulties. Whenever you run out of sanitary goods, you have to be creative and use things like tissues, clothing, or whatever else you can find, which results in a foul odor with every breath. It's embarrassing in general, but it becomes much worse when all your options are exhausted and you have to sit tight. However, it is not all. Inmates in Ananura Prison are subject to rigorous rules and regulations, such as the fact that they are only permitted brief visits from loved ones every 15 days. Women, especially those with children outside of the home who rely on them emotionally and financially, may experience emotions of loneliness and despair as a result of this restricted interaction. Instead of focusing on change, the jail administration continues to prioritize containment, which means that education and rehabilitation programs are severely underfunded. Inmates' mental health might suffer when they are forced to fend for themselves while behind bars. Human rights groups have done a lot of documentation on these situations. Women who had survived Qalyub's brutal and degrading conditions testified to Middle East Watch in 1992. Chronic malnutrition has worsened the already dangerous condition for prisoners due to a lack of sufficient food and medical treatment. However, we have not yet explored the most dreadful institutions. Ananura Prison is far from the worst. Do not miss the next horrifying female jail on our list, so be sure to stay tuned. There has been a lot of talk about change at the jail, but the fact that it is still using harsh techniques has many worried about China's human rights record as a whole. If you're still with me, I'll see you in the next video.